Paris syndrome is a form of psychological culture shock that's characterized by extreme disappointment when visiting the city of Paris. And while it is named after the city of lights and love, it was actually first reported on and by Japanese tourists visiting Paris for the first time. Hiroaki Ota, a psychiatrist who worked at the St. Anne Hospital in France, was the first to coin the term, and even wrote a book about it with the same name in 1981. Paris syndrome is characterized by a bunch of symptoms. Few among them are instances of derealization, anxiety, depersonalization, and in the most extreme cases, vomiting. And I know you're asking, how can a form of culture shock affect people this badly? And there's a lot of theories to this. In a 2004 paper by Viala et al. Suggests that Paris syndrome stems from factors like language barriers, cultural differences, and even exhaustion from traveling. But one factor that I find really interesting is the idealization of Paris, which often comes from the actual reality of Paris as a city not matching the idyllic place of beauty and luxury that a lot of Japanese tourists expect. And there is a frame of reference for this, because Katada Tamami, a worker at Nisei Hospital in Hokkaido in a 1998 report on a patient experiencing manic depression who had also faced Paris syndrome, wrote that, quote, "Living alone in Paris, he had lost his role and identity which gave support to him when he worked as a professor and fulfilled his duties as a father and husband at home in Japan. Moreover, his fantasy and idealization of Paris, characteristic of Paris syndrome, played a great part in his abnormal behaviors." Which I understand. My family went to Paris once and they told me that the whole place constantly smelled like piss. Not as bad as missing your wife and kid, but it does paint a picture of the city. But I find the idealization of Paris really interesting, even with all the harsh truths of the city. Because Europe is a place that's always looked to in Japan. Like, the famous Tokyo Tower was actually just modeled after the Eiffel Tower. There's a whole fake British village that you can go to in Japan. And in terms of anime, every fantasy anime ever is just some faux European setting with the occasional samurai to have something familiar for the local audience. So I wanted to know, why does Japan like to set everything in Europe, and why always that same period of medieval fantasy for anime? There's a lot of other historical aesthetics to choose from, yet it's always that same mid to late medieval setting that anime and manga tend to settle on. And the answer is a lot more simple than you think, actually.
France, Spain, Italy, Egypt, Africa. King, do you think I was born in Africa like you were? Or is it someplace we haven't even thought of yet? How wonderful! Maybe we would find it if we could fly. Oh, but you can't!
So Europe's influence in Japan isn't necessarily something new. It actually goes way back into the country's history. While not the starting point for Western influence, a good example I want to use is the previously mentioned Tokyo Tower. Following an economic boom in the 1950s, Japan as a nation wanted to build a monument that symbolized the national renewal that the country was going through, having been decimated during World War II. And the designer of the Tokyo Tower, Taichu Naito, specifically designed it based on the Eiffel Tower, not out of some specific love of France, because God, imagine being French, but partly out of the desire to emulate the victorious Western powers and as a symbol of moving alongside them in a post-World War II world. And this is not even to mention the whole Meiji period, in where after America having rocked up in the most American way possible, Japan was voracious in consuming Western culture, specifically Europe. European dress was emulated, its culture obsessed over, and its sciences studied. Point is, Japan has a history of wanting to play with the big boys, and learning from and emulating them was its way to do it. We have this modern perception that it's only Western weebs idealizing the glorious Nippon utopia, but Japan also has a history of pogging over foreign concepts and ideas. As with any form of cultural sharing, it's a two-way street. And with these new ideas and aesthetic choices, gave the ability for Japan's burgeoning anime and manga industry new ways of storytelling. Specifically, the ability to talk about topics you wouldn't normally be able to in Japanese society. For example, in a paper by Rebecca Suter regarding shoujo manga and how it exoticizes Europe, she writes that, quote, "The romanticization of Europe played an important part in the comics' critical reflection on the cultural and social norms of their time, particularly in the realms of gender and sexuality." And there was a whole movement that utilized this, by the way. A group calling themselves Nijionen Gumi, or the Year 24 group, are famously known for using Europe in some of their most acclaimed mangas, like The Rose of Versailles and The Po Clan. Shoujo manga during this period was typically seen as a story for little girls with puppy dog romances, but this group was actually a collective of female mangakas who wanted to elevate the shoujo manga genre to include topics like psychology, gender, politics, and even sexuality. In a weird way, shoujo manga, and by extension Europe, became a way of self-expression for these women in socially conservative 1970s Japan. This was a way for these women storytellers to talk about their culture and their places in it without having to directly call anyone out. As famous writer Friedrich Schott said, foreign settings create an exotic quality with storybook sceneries and fashions, and allow heroes and heroines to act in ways that are not always socially possible in Japan. But if shoujo manga was the silent kick that got the ball rolling, then it would be one man and one studio later that introduced Europe in anime with a bang.
Marco, why don't you come back to the Air Force? I've got influence now. I could work something out.
Thanks for the offer, but I'd rather be a pig than a fascist. I only fly for myself.
You really are a pig, aren't you? You realize if they catch a pig, they won't give him a fair...
At this point, you already know who Hayao Miyazaki is. There are so many documentaries and video essays that it's more difficult to find facts that you don't know about him. He's known for a lot many things. Hating on modern anime, saying he's retired but never actually committing to be retired, and absolutely despising his son. God, I feel bad for his son. But one concept I do want to talk about is the idea of Akogare no Paris, or the Paris of our dreams, which is the idea of Europe sensationalized through the eyes of the East. Okay, so you know how some people stereotype Japan as this land of ancient traditions where old meets new with even the most mundane locations looking picturesque? Akogare no Paris is just this, but with Japan looking at Europe. Rolling green hills and meadows, half-timber houses and quaint villages, and crumbling castles on a faraway hill. It's not so much about what Europe actually looks like, but more so the vibe it gives. And you see this in a lot of Ghibli films. Rather than the aesthetic of one country from Europe, a lot of Miyazaki films are a hodgepodge of popular stereotypes and aesthetics from Europe as a whole, which is why Ghibli films always feel like a cozy fairy tale. It's a fantasy vision of Europe. And Miyazaki even rewrites characters to fit this vision. In the movie Lupin III, The Castle of Cagliostro, he completely changed the personality of Lupin. In the original manga, the titular character Lupin is a lecherous thief who steals not because he needs to, but just because he can. And he's down bad for any woman he meets, including your mom. But for the movie, Miyazaki radically changed him. In a newsletter to the Lupin fan club, he explains why he rewrote the character, saying that, quote, Lupin is fighting to give his life meaning and is yearning for someone who can lead him to that fight. He's more happy-go-lucky and upbeat, with a somewhat noble sense of honor. He's willing to do things because it's the right thing to do, not because he'll get something in return. And in a story that's partially about saving a young princess from a forced arranged marriage, it feels like a knight in shining armor coming to save the princess type fantasy, typical in many European fairy tales. But instead of a gallant knight on horseback, it's a suave master thief in a Fiat 500. When you mix a pastoral vision of Europe with Miyazaki's stance of pacifism and adoration of childhood innocence, you get a fantasy of Europe that's ideal in its living and iconic in its aesthetic. And this fantasy vision of Europe still continues until today in modern anime. Every fantasy anime, and I really do mean every, always uses the same faux medieval European aesthetic. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. There are amazing anime that use this generic medieval European aesthetic well, but it just can't be understated how everywhere it is. Doesn't matter if it's isekai or not, it's always some form of Europe. And you can actually blame video games for this, mainly Dungeons & Dragons.
You're playing the most phenomenal game ever created. Your skin grows cold from your first glimpse of the enormous beast. It's a product of your imagination. Use your lightning bolt. Victory is yours. TSR Hobbies. Dungeons & Dragons game. Product.
Okay, so in research for this video, I was surprised to find how many famous JRPGs took inspiration from Dungeons & Dragons. For example, the early Final Fantasies took a lot of liberties from D&D. Red mages are basically bards, some enemies are just straight up jacked from the monster manual, and there was even a system called Vancian magic, where mages could only cast a certain number of spells before having to rest, just like in Dungeons & Dragons. While games like Final Fantasy would eventually move away from these systems, that Western influence really stuck. With RPGs being as popular as they are in Japan, whatever these games did, anime studios imitated as well. And that included copying the way these games looked. Because you gotta remember, anime adaptations of video games aren't really anything new, and with the video game industry being so closely connected to anime and manga in Japan, they basically fed each other the same visual tropes and cliches. If a JRPG had European knights, then anime had to have European knights. If JRPGs had a European-looking village, then anime also had to be set in a European village. Repeat ad nauseum until we reach the modern day. And I'm not even mentioning the fact that there are thousands of professional and amateur light novel and manga artists that use these tropes just because they're there. If it ain't broke, don't fix it. If you're an amateur light novel author or a mangaka that's just starting out and trying to make a name for themselves, why risk trying to do new things? It's just easier and safer to use tropes and cliches that people are familiar with. Some authors know how to leverage its European setting, while others just use it for window dressing for yet another power fantasy. As with any trope or cliche, how well it's used varies from creator to creator. But I think the most interesting part of researching all of this is seeing how we humans love exploring new cultures. In the same way we dumb gaijin romanticize Japan as a modern-day efficient utopia, so too do the Japanese look to Europe as a land of pastoral and elegant living. And yeah, it is romanticized, but I take that as a good sign. It means we look to and appreciate the positives of other cultures, even if the people from that culture might not be aware of them. We're social creatures, always looking for that meaningful connection. We love sharing, even if the world might not think that we do. And it speaks volumes of humanity's innate kindness and curiosity that we're always willing to share in each other's experiences. And it's cool to see anime explore other cultures from a country that's very insular about itself. And I can only imagine what culture anime will explore next.
This for realsies close. Hawks is a total riz cake. You can't unalive that snack. I'd enter my grief era.
I forgot internet culture was a thing. Huh. Skibbity toilet anime when?